Let's jump back to 2007. The century had just turned page to an era of unprecedented tech advances. The video game industry had finally brute-forced its way into mainstream recognition after it became impossible to ignore the medium's financial success. And there was a huge vacancy in terms of a massive sci-fi franchise everyone was keeping up with. Seeing as Star Wars ended 2 years ago with what most people assumed would be the last entry, the field was practically set for someone to seize the opportunity, and BioWare was especially prepared to be the devs to do it. Up until this point, BioWare was pretty much known for its role-playing video games, and specifically ones adapting Dungeons & Dragons rules like Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, and Knights of the Republic. Knights of the Republic being key here because, as I understand, this licensed Star Wars game was a big impetus for the BioWare dev team deciding to develop an original sci-fi IP. Obsidian would take over the creation of KOTOR 2, and BioWare would be free to build their new universe as they see fit. Though this ended up meaning just repurposing and remixing a lot of the elements they used in Knights of the Republic 1. Krogans are dinosaur Mandalorians, Salarians are smart Rhodians, Biotics is a less important version of the Force, that looks just like a human, but with different skin colors and a goofy head as back, but now they all look like women. There's a ton of plot similarities too, like the overarching threat from beyond known space, the process of getting a special position that'll let you investigate with unlimited authority.
It is the decision of the Council that you be granted all the powers and privileges of the Special Tactics and Reconnaissance branch of the Citadel.
Spectres are not trained, but chosen. Individuals forged in the fire of service and battle, those whose actions elevate them above the rank and file.
Spectres are an ideal, a symbol, the embodiment of courage, determination, and self-reliance. They are the right hand of the Council, instruments of our will.
Spectres bear a great burden. They are protectors of galactic peace, both our first and last line of defense. The safety of the galaxy is theirs to uphold.
You are the first human Spectre, Commander. This is a great accomplishment for you and your entire species.
I'm honored, Counselor.
We're sending you into the Traverse after Saren. He's a fugitive from justice, so you are authorized to use any means necessary to apprehend or eliminate him.
I'll find him.
This meeting of the Council is adjourned.
And there are sort of two ways I think you can look at this. Either they just kept with familiar ideas they knew worked in order to make sure they avoided the weak sales of their previous game, Jade Empire. Or, and I think this is more likely, BioWare felt like they had been hamstrung in their ability to fully take these concepts as far as they wanted to within the Star Wars setting. In a way, the Mass Effect franchise was a sort of do-over, a second attempt at a story more uniquely tailored by the creators. And in particular, an ambitious attempt to, as it might have been phrased at the time, make a truly interactive cinematic experience.
The Arcturus Prime relays in range. Initiating transmission sequence.
Commander?
We are connected. Calculating transit mass and destination. The relay is hot. Acquiring approach vector. All stations secure for transit. Forward is green. Approach run has begun.
There had been games that recreated the narrative pace and feel of movies before. Metal Gear was up to MGS3 at this point. And there certainly had been plenty of very interactive games made, maybe even more than there are now, many of which BioWare had personally worked on themselves. But there was a gap right between the two, a style that would theoretically marry the strengths of film and games. This was the target BioWare was trying to hit with Mass Effect, and it causes a lot of the new design choices to make a lot of sense. Gone was the turn-based pen-and-paper RPG combat. Instead, the game would be a third-person shooter with some RPG elements in the form of level-ups and limited dialogue trees. Mass Effect certainly wasn't the first game to give this mix a try, but the vast majority of previous attempts were infamously janky. And at least in the circles I frequented, it was talked about like some kind of mythical, unobtainable treasure you'd always strive towards, but no one would ever actually reach. It has to be put into context that while FPS games were popular, they were still in a weird transitionary phase between 90s boomer shooters and the later 2010s standard, where everything is compared to Battlefield and COD. Hell, Modern Warfare 1 came out the same year as Mass Effect 1, 2007, and Resi 4, the prototype for pretty much all third-person shooter controls, came out 2 years earlier in 2005. So, while today Mass Effect 1's gunplay may come off as the weakest in the franchise, at the time you have to understand that this was maybe the best you were going to get in a game with dialogue options. And honestly, the thing is, it still kinda is that rare. If you had told me 14 years ago that Mass Effect would still be relatively unique among games, that the industry would have doubled down on the cinematic feel but neglected any elements only video games could pull off, I'd very much assume you were lying, or at least I'd be hoping you were. Because honestly, it does kinda make sense from a production perspective. Cinematic feel has already been pioneered by more than a century of cinematographers, directors, editors, etc. As a corp, you don't need to put any time or resources into developing that feel. Your goal is just to recreate the styles that other people have already taken the risks for. This means you don't need to rely on the ideas of any creative types. You just need a dedicated crew of coders and artists not in leadership positions who are desperate enough for work that you won't have to pay them during the very consistent overtime stints. Except you don't even need that anymore either, because it's commonplace to release games unfinished after companies like Bethesda normalized fan patching and others started the whole day one hotfix thing. However, that all makes this situation sound inevitable, like a big lumbering corporate machine that'll unavoidably continue down this formulaic path. But I don't believe that. I don't think these companies are as rational and dedicated towards profit as they're made out to be. Not that companies don't try to be, mind you. This isn't some sort of apologist take. All I'm saying is that they're run by humans, and specifically humans who a lot of the time got into their position of authority due to networking, which isn't exactly the best judge of merit. Meaning they're just following the dialogue and trends gamers themselves are talking about. It was gamers who, during this period, started obsessing over cinematics and spectacle. It was gamers that talked about how the choices all feel shallow, but the set pieces were cool, I guess. And yes, that's people trying to say, I wish you had spent more time on the consequences of my choices, but on the other hand, the action was on point. But I think instead, when companies hear that message, what they get is, the narrative stuff isn't working without spending more resources on it. But the action is already liked and will sell as is next year. So, that's sort of what I'm trying to get at here. What was Mass Effect trying to be from the start with 1? How did public response shape the direction 2 took, and why it ended up leading to 3 as an inevitability? But before we can get to those last couple, we need to start at the beginning, because Mass Effect 1, in hindsight, is by far the most different, and in my opinion, stand out of the trio. Right from the start, I have to point out the music. For sure, one of my favorite, if not all-time favorite soundtracks for a game.
I have studied the Protheans for decades, but I have never felt this sense of foreboding. What will we find down there?
Whatever we find, be cautious. If this were simply an automated trap, Saren would have triggered it as well.
You are not Prothean, but you are not machine either.
Completely oppositional to the later entry's more traditional dramatic orchestral vibes, 1's OST is much smaller and creepier. With Mass Effect 2 and 3, when I hear the ambience of a planet or battle, the visuals could be replaced with almost anything, and I wouldn't bat an eye. It's not bad, but it also inherently blends in. When you hear the looping synth notes that accompany 1, you know you're playing Mass Effect. None of the songs are all that complex, and there aren't as many as I wish there were, but every single one presents a very catered atmosphere. The synth obviously gives off futuristic vibes, but it's very particularly of the retro variety. There's a sense of age and heritage to the setting and its technology. The simplicity and thus lack of many instruments all playing at once also adds to a sense of emptiness, as if these places are a lot less populated than they should be. Look, I know very little about music theory, but even I can immediately tell what Mass Effect 1 is all about just from listening. I listen to these tunes for a second, and I'm already thinking, alright, this is a dark, mysterious sci-fi setting where humans are probably new to things. Everyone else is probably tired and grumpy, but ultimately there's a core of hope at the game's heart. And while a lot of that got carried over in its sequels, those first 2 points not as much. Because it's hard to keep up any kind of ominous mystery when your last entry has Earth being used, like a chew toy, by a million visually exact clones of your first game's secret main bad guy. If you just pretend that none of that happened yet, though, you start to remember the sinister, eldritch energy the original game emanates. This is not the happy-go-lucky but dangerous Wild West of 2. Instead, everyone is constantly on edge. Anywhere that isn't a corrupt corporate hellhole is under fire from all sorts of horrors that haven't been seen in thousands of years. Pretty much every person you talk to in 1 is either so anxious you're scared they're about to have a panic attack.
What? No! Sorry, I haven't had much sleep since the attack. Is there something you need?
Or really pissed because their career is falling apart because someone, probably in the same room, decided to sabotage them. No one is doing well, no one has a complete picture of what's going on, and everyone is too terrified to do anything differently. You get this intense sense that humanity has just blundered its way into a situation that everyone else wants out of. Which seems awful, but that's also where the power fantasy element comes in. You get to play as a government agent with no oversight and problems big enough that you can ignore most people's lives as being inconsequential in the face of galactic crisis. Your mission to stop Saren and investigate the Reapers not only gives you purpose, but gives you the excuse to actually take the time to follow through on leads and theories most NPCs only get to speculate about. It's sort of the reverse of Fallout 4, where in that game a lot of players complained that it felt disjointed to have this massive open world designed for you to explore, while the main quest guilted you away from that with its kidnapped child plot. In Mass Effect 1, there is no rush. You have no idea what time frame the villains are working on, but it certainly is nowhere near fast enough for you to have to worry about. It's not like in later Mass Effect games where you're an extreme underdog out against impossible odds. By the time the game opens up and the main plot has really kicked into gear, you're pretty on par with your apparent antagonist, Saren. Yeah, he's got an army and you don't, but it's made pretty clear that his force is small enough no one noticed he was building it, and weak enough that all he's willing to attack are distant colonies the Citadel already deemed super risky. Not that you're presented as some kind of unstoppable force here to clean up whatever planet you visit, like you are more so in 3. But your little secret gang is more than capable of screwing up Reaper plans, obtaining sensitive intel, or simply just evening the odds. That being said, you're going to all these worlds and participating in all these missions not primarily to go single-handedly fight your personal war. You're there to solve the mystery of the Reapers. And that's a really key difference between 1 and all the other games. Sure, in 2, there's the mystery of who the Collectors are, and in 3, there's the mystery of where the Reapers came from, but they're both kind of side plots. Shepard wants to know who the Collectors are, specifically to stop whoever is attacking human colonies, and Shepard wants to know where the Reapers come from in order to discover a way to fight them. Both mysteries are just a means to the ultimate end of the games. On the other hand, with Mass Effect 1, you're not discovering who the Reapers are in order to stop Saren. That doesn't make any sense. Saren's working for the Reapers. You're stopping Saren in order to discover who the Reapers are. The mystery is the ultimate end rather than just the means along the way. It's a completely different narrative structure that affects every single aspect of the game by slowing it down and filling all the choices with a certain amount of dread. If you don't exactly know where the series was heading, or how a lot of these setups like the ancient Protheans or the Reaper cycles are going to play out, everything you do suddenly feels a lot more important. Sure, now having played 3, it's really obvious that saving this ancient race of bugs that almost wiped out the galaxy was just going to be a little bonus as a reward for being nice and believing in second chances. And in the context of only Mass Effect 1 being out, you as the player have no idea where that decision could lead. I mean, the devs could have easily had the collectors in 2 have turned out to be cyborged Rachni instead, and maybe your choice to save the Rachni Queen would have eventually helped defeat whatever this version of Harbinger would be.
One serves as our voice. We cannot sing, not in these low spaces. Your musics are colorless.
We filled you with enough plasma to pop a tank.
This vessel is at the edge, yet she struggles. You cannot see her magnificence. We are breathing on the embers. We are the mother. We sing for those left behind, the children you thought silenced. We are Rachni.
What's key about Mass Effect 1's pacing is that they broach subjects a while before you're actually forced to deal with them. Sovereign being a unique, weird, sentient ship with magic mind control powers is not something you're introduced to and then deal with in the same hour. Instead, the game starts off by showing you this big ominous ship that everyone comments shouldn't be able to land on a planet, but somehow does.
What is that? Off in the distance.
It's a ship. Look at the size of it.
Bunch of people talk about this weird signal that makes it hard to think.
Emitting some kind of signal as it descended. It sounded like the shriek of the damned, only it was coming from inside your own head.
It was probably trying to block communication.
And you're like, okay, that's not crazy. Especially because the setting is new and you don't fully understand its limits yet. So, well, the Geth are now known to be the red herrings of the series. When it was first released, the Geth being an AI species and the Reapers being very synthetic, made the line between Reaper tech and Geth tech kind of unclear, especially when Geth and Reaper architecture look pretty similar. So it's not crazy to think at first that maybe the Geth just used their stereotypically fast AI brains to make a hyper-advanced ship with some kind of signal whose purpose is just currently unclear. Then, as you get further in, you start hearing about psychological conditioning, ancient civilization killers, religious Geth, and Saren's own vulnerability to his squid ship, which all seems to lead to a different answer. At earliest, you have to go through the prologue, the starting hub, and 2 more main quest worlds before you even get the option to pull back the curtain and meet the real main antagonists of the whole game. Because, well, gameplay-wise, all the Mass Effect games are action RPGs. Mass Effect 1 is the only one whose genre, plot-wise, is a cosmic horror thriller. Ancient, unimaginable beings who think of themselves as gods. Militant religious groups dropping all convention to carry out secret attacks. Intense xenophobia and racism, making society too self-paranoid to acknowledge actual existential threats. Mass Effect 1 is pretty much straight up, how would a future human society and their alien buddies deal with the old gods? Because that's what Saren is if you weren't already aware. An ancient being of immense power and size who has been asleep for forever, also has a cult and a hypnosis insanity aura that kills you after long enough, or if you're too weak-willed. It's literally just Robot Cthulhu, separated from his old god crew. And unlike a lot of media that tries to do cosmic horror, Mass Effect 1 doesn't just tell you that you're swimming with prehistoric sharks. The game itself, through gameplay design, enemy choice, area types, music, drills that into you almost immediately. For example, one of the big reasons Mass Effect 2's fight encounters feel a lot better isn't just that they removed 1's weapon overheating system and replaced it with a more traditional pretend ammo counter.
This pistol doesn't have a thermal clip.
It's a med bay. We'll get you a clip. Keep your head down, Shepard. Shield yourself from the blast. Someone's hacking security trying to kill you. Look for a thermal clip for your pistol. Looks like they set up a barricade to try holding the mechs off. Look out! It's more so that Mass Effect 2's enemy variety, and more importantly the variety of their behaviors and abilities, completely outshines 1. Yeah, there are quite a few different looking enemies in the original Mass Effect, but overall they all kinda act the same, and thus there really isn't much to its combat puzzles. I don't think this is a symptom of the original's role-playing game elements, like some people have suggested. I suspect a lot of people say that because Mass Effect 2 both coincidentally fixed this combat issue and removed a lot of the original RPG mechanics. And because in Mass Effect 1 the difficulty of a lot of fight encounters was dependent on the quality of gear you had. But I really think that isn't the cause of the combat feeling so janky in 1. 2 and 3 both had weapons that worked on overheating, and those didn't ruin the combat, and plenty of games now have more in-depth RPG mechanics, yet have good-feeling gunplay. Mass Effect 1 was just made on a lower budget, and with what I assume to be a smaller team. And honestly, there was no reason for BioWare to expect to get a massive franchise out of this. So they had to focus down on something specific. I mean, don't you think it's weird that Commander Shepard's very first major assignment ends up with them meeting so many ancient creatures and important artifacts?
Tell me everything you know about the Thorian.
The Thorian is a simple plant life form that exhibits a sentient behavior uncommon with other flora. Through dispersion and the eventual inhalation of spores, it can affect and control other organisms, including humans. The Zoo's Hope control group has yielded interesting results. Before sensors went offline, almost 85% of all test subjects were infected.
Are you saying Exogeny knew its people were getting infected?
It was
just like throwing a color filter over a scene changes how you feel about it. Having a cast of enemies and allies focused on a specific type changes how you feel about its universe. In Mass Effect 1, everything you encounter is potentially threatening. Even friendly NPCs are constantly scheming and pushing their own agendas. The galaxy is presented as this dark sea in which blips of civilization survive, like wagons encircled around campfires at night. But even within their own walls, monsters are being loosed, and armies from beyond traveled space are encroaching. This is not a dystopian galaxy, but every inch of it drips with dread. Mass Effect 2, on the other hand, is a cast filled mostly with mercs, thugs, crime syndicates, and corporate security. This isn't inherently a bad thing, and there's still a lot of strange beasts and Reaper creatures, though they're relegated a lot of times to key plot events. What this effectively does is change the entire feel of the setting, and I think unintentionally removes much of the setting's horror aesthetic. Instead, Mass Effect morphs to become something more realistic and grounded. Instead of a galaxy focused on cryptids and secrets, it's more like a galaxy focused on crime and money. But here's the thing about all this that I have to give to BioWare. I feel that, especially compared to most franchises that change direction quickly, Mass Effect 2 in no way ruins 1, and even beyond that, 3 doesn't ruin 2. Every time I go back through this series, well, every entry hits me like it's from a different franchise, I still enjoy all 2 1/4 of it. And from what I can tell, that's generally the consensus among both people who prefer 1 and 2, though some maybe without that last 4th included. And you might respond, well, obviously, 1 and 2 were good, and no one really liked 3, so people enjoy playing through 1 and 2. But I don't think you're really considering how rare it is for a piece of media to jump tone so drastically, and for almost no one, especially after more than a decade, to really hate either of them.
We've seen franchises get resurrected from the dead a decade or more after the fact before, and that's not even factoring in the rumors about Mass Effect 4. This isn't a Star Wars situation where you've got a faction of fans vying for the original tone and others more attached to the prequels, where there's a lot of passion for making the films, but not a lot for what exactly they're supposed to be. The worry being that everyone has their own idea of what it was supposed to be, and no confidence to just create something distinct. With Mass Effect, that seems pretty much not an issue. Even the Mass Effects that most people don't like aren't put down because of setting inconsistency. There are tons of sci-fi and fantasy series that struggle constantly with artistic cohesion, staying on model, and even just looking slightly different. But even when Andromeda drama reached its peak and players were basically trashing every single pixel of animation, it always stayed neatly at, this is a bad Mass Effect, not this isn't Mass Effect. And I think a lot of this is because right from the start, Mass Effect 1 made it clear that everything you were experiencing, everyone you were meeting, was focused to help convey the tone of its plot. So every future Mass Effect is free to do the same thing, with 2 able to shift genre to fit its new narrative. Which means making a new Mass Effect game should be a lot easier than most. You're not as tied down to the previous work. Really, as long as the team gets the time, money, and staff it needs, a new Mass Effect should be an easy new trilogy. I'm sure BioWare's publisher would never just burn their investment by skimping out on all 3.